You step outside your office building. Your fingers already know the motion. A small metal wheel, a spark, a flame. You breathe in and something in your chest finally loosens. You've probably told yourself this is a modern habit, a stress response invented for a stressful world. But the real answer is far stranger. That small ritual you just performed, the reaching, the lighting, the inhaling, is not new. It is not even close to new. Somewhere on a cold desert floor in what is now Utah, more than 12,000 years ago, someone crouched beside a fire and did something remarkably similar. They were not office workers. They were not thinking about deadlines, but their hands and their brains were doing something eerily familiar. Your ancestors met this molecule long before they met a wheel, a plow, or a written word. Why does a plant chemical still command this kind of loyalty tens of thousands of years later? Stay with that question, the answer will not go where you expect. Most people assume smoking is a recent invention, something tied to cigarette factories, advertising, and the modern stresses of city life. It feels like a habit that belongs to the last few centuries at most, but the timeline archaeologists have uncovered doesn't just push that date back a little. It shatters it completely, dragging the origin of this behavior into an era before farming, before permanent settlements, before almost everything you associate with human civilization. Long before any hearth in Utah, your ancestors had already formed a relationship with fire itself. Early hominins are believed to have controlled fire in some form as far back as 1,000,000 years ago, using it for warmth, protection, and cooking. Fire changed almost everything about how early humans lived. It extended the day past sunset. It gathered people into a small circle of light and warmth, night after night, generation after generation. And it is precisely in that circle, beside that flickering warmth, that so many of humanity's earliest social behaviors likely took shape. Storytelling, shared food, shared substances. Is it really a coincidence that the oldest evidence of tobacco use was found inside a fire pit rather than scattered randomly across an open camp? Picture the world before farming. No cities, no writing, no permanent houses, just small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across harsh, open land, following animals, reading weather, surviving on knowledge passed mouth to mouth. This is the world archaeologists were studying when they excavated a site called Wishbone, tucked into the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. A researcher named Darren Duke, working with a team from the Far Western Anthropological Research Group, was not looking for tobacco. He was studying an ancient hearth, a fire pit used by hunter-gatherers who camped there at the tail end of the last ice age. The site had first been uncovered years earlier, but it took careful, patient excavation to reveal what was hiding inside it. Around that fire, his team found stone tools, likely used for hunting and preparing food. They found bones from waterfowl and other small game, evidence of a meal shared around that same flame. This was a working camp, a practical place, used by people focused on survival in a landscape that would have shown them no mercy for carelessness. And tucked into the ash of that hearth, alongside all those practical, everyday objects, they found something almost invisible. 4 tiny charred seeds. Those seeds came from a wild tobacco plant. Scientists dated the surrounding burned wood using a method called radiocarbon dating, which sounds complicated but is actually simple in principle. Every living thing absorbs a faint, naturally occurring radioactive version of carbon while it's alive. Once it dies, that radioactive carbon slowly decays at a fixed, predictable rate. Measure how much is left, and you can calculate almost exactly how long ago that plant or animal died. It's a natural clock buried in the ash. That clock told Duke's team something remarkable. Those seeds were burned around 12,300 years ago. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence of tobacco use came from smoking pipes found in Alabama containing nicotine residue, dated to about 3,300 years ago. The Utah seeds pushed the timeline back by roughly 9,000 years. 9,000 years, sitting quietly in the sand waiting to be found. Here's what makes this stranger than it first sounds. Those seeds don't burn well on their own. They wouldn't have been useful as fuel. And there's no evidence tobacco was growing naturally right at that campsite. The nearest wild tobacco would have grown on hills over 8 miles away. Someone had to travel there, someone had to carry it back and place it deliberately near that fire. Why would anyone bother? What could be worth that effort in a world where every calorie and every hour mattered for survival? The most likely answer is simple and a little unsettling. They wanted what the plant does to the brain. Wild tobacco contains a chemical called nicotine, and nicotine is an alkaloid, which just means it's a naturally occurring, nitrogen-based compound that plants produce and that has a strong effect on animal nervous systems. In small amounts, nicotine sharpens focus. It triggers the release of a brain chemical called dopamine, which creates a feeling of pleasure and reward. Your ancestors, it turns out, were chasing that same feeling you chase every time you light a cigarette or pour a strong coffee. Duke himself put it plainly in an interview after the discovery. He said that seeing people at a fireside using tobacco, you can pretty easily imagine what they were getting out of it. It is, in his words, very human to imbibe. But here's where the story deepens and where the timeline gets genuinely strange. Tobacco use came thousands of years before tobacco domestication. The earliest evidence of humans actually cultivating tobacco as a crop, growing it deliberately like a garden plant, comes from South America and dates to only about 8,000 years ago. That means for roughly 4,000 years, and likely far longer, humans were using wild tobacco long before they ever tried to farm it. Think about what that means. Humans didn't stumble onto tobacco by accident while inventing agriculture. They sought it out first as hunter-gatherers, purely wild, purely foraged. The desire came before the domestication. The craving came before the crop. So why does a plant produce a chemical this powerful in the first place? This is where the story stops being just archaeology and becomes something closer to a chemical arms race, one that has been running for millions of years. Plants cannot run from danger. They cannot bite, sting, or flee a hungry insect chewing through their leaves. So instead, over millions of years, many plants evolved something else: chemical weapons. Bitter, toxic compounds designed to poison or repel the animals trying to eat them. Nicotine is one of these. In the tobacco plant, it functions as an insecticide, a defense chemical meant to kill or deter insects that try to feed on its leaves. In other words, the very thing your ancestors were drawn to was, chemically speaking, a poison, a pesticide built by the plant to kill things much smaller than a human. And yet humans across continents and across thousands of years kept coming back for more. This is exactly the puzzle that researchers Edward Hagen and Roger Sullivan set out to explain. Their work asks a pointed question. If nicotine and chemicals like it in coffee, cannabis, and other plants are genuinely toxic defenses meant to punish anything that eats them, why does the human brain respond with pleasure instead of alarm? Why does something built to repel insects end up rewarding primates instead? Their answer involves what's sometimes called a toxin defense hijacking hypothesis. Though you don't need to remember that term, here's the plain version. Your body evolved detection systems to notice bitter, toxic plant chemicals. The same way a smoke detector notices smoke. Originally, that system existed purely to protect you, to make you spit something out before it hurt you. But over evolutionary time, in small enough doses, some of these plant toxins started interacting with the brain's reward circuitry in ways that felt good rather than dangerous. The warning system got quietly rewired into a reward system. There's a physical hint that supports this idea, and it comes from a very different corner of the world. Researchers studying the Aka, a group of hunter-gatherers in Central Africa, found something unexpected when looking at cannabis use. People with higher levels of THC, the active chemical in cannabis, in their bodies tended to have lower levels of intestinal parasites. The pattern suggests that some plant toxins may double as a kind of natural anti-parasitic medicine, taken in small doses on purpose. Whether or not the people taking them consciously understood why, could the same logic apply to nicotine? Researchers studying the evolutionary history of drug use argue that many so-called recreational substances may have started as something closer to preventive medicine. Not pleasure first, survival first. There's another layer to this, offered by researchers Randolph Nesse and Kent Berridge, who study emotion from an evolutionary angle. Their view is that psychoactive substances work by tapping directly into the brain systems that control motivation and emotion systems built over millions of years to guide behavior toward things that help survival and away from things that threaten it. A plant chemical that can nudge those systems, even temporarily, can make a person feel briefly stronger, calmer, or more capable than they actually are. In a harsh Ice Age landscape, even a temporary boost like that might have mattered. A sharper mind during a hunt, A steadier nerve during a long, cold night, a small edge, repeated often enough, across enough generations to leave a mark on how the modern brain responds to that same chemical today. None of this required understanding, in the way a modern chemist understands it. Your ancestors didn't need to know what dopamine was or what an alkaloid was to notice that a certain plant used a certain way changed how they felt. Observation was enough trial and error. Repeated across countless individuals and countless winters was enough to lock a behavior into culture long before anyone could explain why it worked. This is the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with for a moment. You likely assumed early humans discovered tobacco the way people discover it today, socially, recreationally, maybe even accidentally through fire. But the evidence points somewhere else. It suggests your ancestors were, in Duke's own words, the ultimate botanists. They were testing, tasting, and identifying which plants around them carried powerful effects, and doing it with startling speed after arriving in new environments. This wasn't idle experimentation. It was a form of applied hands-on pharmacology, thousands of years before anyone had a word for pharmacology at all. And notice what this reframes. The story of tobacco use isn't a story about weakness or about a bad habit humans eventually invented once life got easier. It's closer to the opposite. It's a story about early humans as sharp, observant problem solvers, identifying a chemical that altered focus, mood, and possibly health, and choosing to use it deliberately long before farming, long before writing, long before anything you'd recognize as civilization. This is easy to miss because modern culture tends to frame tobacco use almost entirely through the lens of harm, disease, and regret. Those associations are real and well documented, but they belong to a very recent chapter of a much older story, one shaped by industrial farming, mass production, and chemical additives that didn't exist for most of the 12,000 years this relationship has lasted. Strip all of that away. Go back to a single wild leaf beside a single fire. And what you're left with is something closer to early experimentation than modern indulgence. Your ancestors were not reaching for an escape from a stressful world. They were reaching for information, testing what a plant could do, one small dose at a time, in a world that offered no manuals and no warnings, only trial, memory, and whatever got passed down to the next generation around that same fire. Now, here's a detail that adds another layer. The Utah seeds don't prove people were smoking tobacco the way you'd picture it today in a rolled cigarette or a pipe. The seeds suggest tobacco leaves may have been chewed, sucked, or twisted into a kind of quid and held in the mouth, with the seeds spit out near the fire afterward. Actual smoking, inhaling burned plant matter through a pipe, shows up in the archaeological record later. The oldest confirmed smoking pipes with nicotine residue come from Alabama, dated to roughly 3,300 years ago. By the time you reach the ancient Maya, several thousand years later still, tobacco use had become deeply ritualized. Carved stone panels at the Maya site of Palenque show figures smoking ornate pipes, captured in stone for later generations to find sacred Maya text describe tobacco woven into ceremony, storytelling, and myth. One well-known passage describes two mythic heroes who were required to keep their cigars burning through an entire night inside a cave of darkness, only to outwit their captors by attaching fireflies to the tips instead, letting the glow do the work while the tobacco itself stayed unburned. It's a small detail, but it tells you something important. By this point, tobacco wasn't simply consumed. It was central enough to a culture's imagination to become the subject of its stories. Researchers have also identified nicotine residue inside a Maya flask over 1,300 years old, confirming through chemistry what the carvings and texts had long suggested. Tobacco had become woven into ritual, religion, and daily life across an entire civilization, carried by hand from person to person, generation to generation, long before anyone called it an addiction, and long before anyone called it a habit at all. So somewhere between that Ice Age hearth in Utah and the temples of the Maya, chewing became smoking, and private habit became public ceremony. The chemical stayed the same. What changed was the meaning humans built around it, which brings you back to the question sitting underneath all of this. Why does this particular molecule still have this much power over a modern brain, thousands of years and thousands of miles removed from that first desert campfire? The honest answer involves biology more than willpower. Nicotine crosses into your bloodstream and reaches your brain remarkably fast, often within seconds of inhaling it. Once there, it binds to receptors that normally respond to a natural brain chemical involved in attention, learning, and muscle control. Those receptors weren't built for tobacco. They were already there, doing entirely different jobs, long before any plant chemical came along to exploit them. Nicotine simply fits into them the way a key happens to fit a lock it was never designed for. Once nicotine locks into place, it triggers a release of dopamine, a brain chemical closely tied to motivation and reward. Dopamine doesn't just create pleasure in a simple sense. It teaches your brain what to pay attention to and what to repeat. Every time an action is followed by a dopamine release, your brain quietly files that action away as something worth doing again. This is the same basic system that rewards you for eating when you're hungry, for succeeding at a difficult task, for finding warmth on a cold night. It is ancient, essential, and largely indifferent whether the thing triggering it is genuinely good for you in the long run. Your ancestors' brains had this system already fully in place, built for entirely different purposes, long before tobacco entered the picture. Tobacco didn't invent the system. It simply found a way in, and once inside, it has stayed there for over 12,000 years. This is why quitting is so difficult, and why the difficulty has nothing to do with character. You're not fighting a personal weakness. You're fighting a reward pathway that evolved over millions of years, one that any sufficiently clever plant chemical can exploit. Nicotine happens to be extraordinarily good at exploiting it, arguably one of the most efficient plant chemicals ever discovered for reaching this particular part of the brain, this quickly, this reliably. Is it really surprising, then, that so many people who consciously want to quit still struggle for years, even when they fully understand the health risks, even when they genuinely want to stop? It's worth noticing what this reframes about willpower itself. A person struggling to quit smoking is not failing at something simple that should be easy to overcome through sheer determination. They are, in a very real sense, negotiating with a piece of neural machinery that has had an enormous head start, refined across an almost incomprehensible span of evolutionary time. Long before that person was ever born, long before the specific product in their hand existed at all. Consider how this plays out today, far beyond any cigarette. The coffee you reach for first thing in the morning works on a strikingly similar system. A different plant chemical, caffeine aimed at many of the same ancient pathways. The vape pen a teenager hides in a bag between classes. The nicotine gum a parent chews at their desk, trying to unwind a habit built over decades. The energy drink cracked open before a long shift. Each one is a modern variation on something your species began doing in a desert more than 12,000 years ago. The packaging changed. The delivery method changed. The underlying relationship between human brain chemistry and plant defense chemicals barely changed at all. Public health researchers today describe nicotine addiction using careful clinical language. Tolerance, dependence, withdrawal, relapse, and all of that language is accurate, but it can make the behavior sound like a strictly modern malfunction, something that only exists because of factories and marketing and modern stress. The archaeology tells a very different story underneath the clinical one. The wiring came first. The modern products simply learned to plug into wiring that was already there, built across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, long before any company existed to profit from it. Think, too, about how quickly people today adopt new ways of getting the same chemical. A disposable vape looks nothing like a chewed tobacco leaf beside an Ice Age fire. But strip away the plastic, the flavoring, the marketing, and you are left with the same basic transaction your ancestors were making. A small dose of a plant-derived chemical delivered to the brain in exchange for a shift in mood or focus. Only the wrapping paper has changed. Why does that wrapping paper convince so many people that this is a brand new problem, invented in their own lifetime? Tobacco is far from alone in this story. Coffee, tea, cacao, and cannabis all follow a strikingly similar arc across human history. Each began as a wild plant, carrying a chemical that affected the nervous system. Each was noticed, tested, and adopted by people long before anyone understood the underlying biology. Each was eventually woven into ritual, then trade, then daily routine, until it became so ordinary that most people never stopped to ask where the habit actually came from. Tobacco simply happens to have left one of the oldest, clearest fingerprints of this entire pattern, buried in the ash of a single Ice Age fire. Waiting 12,000 years to be found, there's something almost humbling in that. You might walk past someone on a smoke break and think of it as a small modern vice, easily judged, easily dismissed. But what you're actually watching is one of the oldest continuous behaviors in human history, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than the first city ever built. It began not as an addiction in the way you might think of one today, but as an act of careful, curious experimentation by people trying to understand the plants around them and what those plants could do for their bodies and minds. And this is worth remembering. The next time you feel the pull of a habit you can't quite explain, whether it's nicotine, caffeine, or something else entirely, that pull isn't necessarily a flaw in you. It may be evidence of something your brain has been doing in one form or another for longer than history itself has been recorded. The question was never, really, why do people still do this? The question is, why did anyone expect that pull to be easy to resist in the first place, when it's older than almost everything else you consider modern? So think again about that person stepping outside for a cigarette, their fingers already knowing the motion, the spark, the flame, the breath that finally loosens something in the chest. They probably believe they're performing a small modern habit born from stress, born from this exact century. But the real answer is far stranger. They are quietly repeating a gesture first made beside a fire in a cold desert more than 12,000 years before they were born by someone who was in their own way doing exactly what humans have always done, reaching for a plant that reaches right back.